Alright, in this video, I wanted to give a really brief introduction to the topic we're currently covering, which are the characteristics that all animals share and their evolutionary path towards all the diverse animals that we see around us today. So we'll do a brief overview in this video, and then in some other videos we will expand on each individual topic and idea to gain more depth. So let's begin by thinking about the characteristics that all animals share in common. So there's a set of characteristics that all animals share. And we'll list them here so that we can all be on the same page. So we'll start by saying that every single animal is eukaryotic. Okay, so that means they have complex cells with membrane-bound organelles, right? So all animals are eukaryotic. Another trait that is true for all animals is that their cells lack cell walls. So this differentiates animals from some of the other eukaryotic organisms, like the plants. Plants always have a cellulose cell wall. And fungus. Fungus always have a chitin cell wall. So animals are distinct in that they lack a cell wall. All right, another characteristic that all animals have in common is that they are all heterotrophic. That means they consume the organic molecules of other organisms. Animals eat other organisms to gain the carbon building blocks that animals need to grow. Okay, so heterotrophic is different than autotrophic, like the plants. So being heterotrophic distinguishes animals from plants. But organisms like fungus and many protists, they're also heterotrophic. So there are additional ways that we distinguish between animals and those other organisms. So another characteristic that all animals have in common is that they perform internal digestion. So we're heterotrophic, we eat other things, and we digest those other things internally, inside our body structure. That's different than what fungus do. Fungus grow on their food and digest that food externally. All right, so all animals are eukaryotic, they lack cell walls, they're heterotrophic, and they digest internally. The very last characteristic we're going to add is that all animals are multicellular. And that will help us distinguish from animals and protists that share these other features that animals have. So there are some protists that are eukaryotic, lacking a cell wall, heterotrophic with internal digestion. What sets animals apart from those protists is that we are multicellular. So every animal we're going to talk about has those characteristics, but we're going to talk about a wide variety of animals. And the way we organize the animals we're going to talk about is to put them on one of these phylogenetic trees, which tells us about the relationships that animals have with one another. And we're going to separate animals into these 9 phylum, or phyla. So you can see the names of each of the kinds of animals, each phylum of animals that we are going to study, listed here at the ends of the branches for this tree. We have the phylum names, and in some cases I've included a common name as well for that phylum, because those names are sometimes interchangeable. So we're going to talk a lot about this evolutionary tree for animals. We're going to add a whole bunch of traits to this evolutionary tree that will help us distinguish each phylum from the others. And all I want to do in this video is just introduce those important traits that we're going to use to distinguish between the different phylum. And then in other videos, we'll go more in depth about each of those traits and what these terms mean. So if we trace back to the root of this tree, so on the far left, where this tree begins, the common ancestor of all animals would be a protist. It's a eukaryotic cell without a cell wall that's heterotrophic and does internal digestion. But protists are not multicellular. And if we trace up this tree from that ancestral protist through these branches, we can add the first adaptation onto this tree, and that is having the trait of multicellularity. So we passed this point on the tree when these protists became multicellular, and now we had animals. And the evolution of that multicellular organism has led to all these different phylum of animals that we're going to study. So as we go, we're going to add additional dots onto this tree with additional traits that get added to some of these branches. And those are the traits, again, we're going to use to distinguish between the different phylum of animals. So the first trait that gets added on the next branch is the addition of true tissue. We'll talk a lot about tissue for certain organisms. So this top branch added true tissue, but the bottom branch doesn't have true tissue. They just are a multicellular organism, and they are the sponges. But all the other phylum have this trait of having true tissue, which we'll talk more about in another video. As we continue up the tree, we'll add additional traits. So in this next branch, we're going to look at different forms of symmetry. So in another video, we'll discuss the difference between bilateral symmetry and radial symmetry. And then we'll talk about the difference in tissue layers. Some organisms are what we call triploblastic, where they have 3 layers of tissue, whereas other organisms are diploblastic, or just having 2 layers of tissue. So these traits were added along the way. We'll continue on to the next branch of the tree. We're going to talk about a trait that distinguishes these branches being either deuterostomes or protostomes. This deuterostome-protostome difference relates to how the organism develops when it's an embryo. And again, we'll talk more about that difference in another video. Then we get to another branch right here in the middle on the protostome arm. Here we're going to talk about 2 differences. Some organisms are what we call lophotrochozoans, whereas other organisms are ecdysozoans, right? 2 very difficult to pronounce names, but we will talk about what the difference is between these 2 kinds of organisms. And those are all the traits that we will try to think about when we're differentiating between the different phylum in this animal evolutionary tree. Okay, so there'll be other videos on each of those traits, but I just want to point out that if you have this tree, you can then trace across a line to the end branch and know what traits something at the end of a branch has. So for example, the annelids, things like earthworms, okay? We know they're multicellular because we can trace from the root of the tree through multicellularity. To get to annelids, we go through true tissue. So annelids have true tissue. To get to the annelids, we trace through bilateral symmetry and being triploblastic. We know that annelids are protostomes, and we know that annelids are lophotrochozoans, and we get there. So by putting the information on the tree like this, we can really look up any of the information we need to know about a particular organism. So that's where we'll stop right now. Again, there will be further videos on each of these specific traits and what these words mean. And as we go, we'll talk about all these different phylum of animals. So as always, let me know if you have questions, and I will talk to you again soon.